Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for an Awake Security webinar titled CISO Perspectives, Security Budgeting Post-COVID, Selling Your Priorities Internally. My name is Rudolph Araujo, and I'm the VP of Marketing at Awake Security. We hope everyone is doing well as possible given the times. As we go into the second half of the year, many CISOs and security teams are thinking about what their priorities should be for this second half and how to manage a budget, one that could potentially be decreasing given some of the economic uncertainty. The challenge often is how to pick from several number one priorities while also ensuring your risk posture continues to be enhanced. We are joined today by veteran CISO Malcolm Harkins. Malcolm will share a framework he uses for this purpose that focuses on evaluating each priority through the lens of business value creation. He will walk us through several case studies of how he and teams he advises have used this framework to perform the financial analysis necessary to justify the projects. By ways of background, Malcolm serves as a CISO advisor to our board of directors and leadership team. Currently serving as the Chief Security and Trust Officer at Cymatic, he previously held the same role at endpoint security AI leader Cylance. Malcolm also served as the Chief Security and Privacy Officer of Intel for more than a decade. He has received numerous awards and recognition and is a frequent speaker at industry events, published many articles, and is the author of Managing Risk and Information Security, Protect to Enable. If you have questions or technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the Q&A or chat features in Zoom. With that said, Malcolm, over to you.
Thanks, Rudolph. And hopefully the perspectives I'll share here are useful for everyone. Again, as a bit more background on me for those that haven't heard me speak before, and it's one of the reasons why the kind of the budgeting aspect and how to sell this stuff is something that I focus on a lot. I'm a former finance guy and a former procurement guy. And so when I started at Intel 28, 29 years ago, I was first in the IT strategic procurement team, buying hardware, software services for the IT organization to support the business, and then in IT finance for a number of years. So with that background, I always think of things through business value, total cost. And this came about out of some dialogues from some friends that when COVID-19 hit, they felt the economic shockwave and they had some budget reductions and headcount challenges, and yet they still needed to improve their risk posture. And so they came to me and asked for how I would think through some things. So out of helping them think through it, it kind of created this material that I'm going to share with you today. So again, with that as a little bit of a background, I've always looked at things, as I said, from a business value perspective. That's me being a former finance guy, and always wanting to deliver economic value to the business or the organization I support. Recently, Gartner had done a study, and part of their assessment of security teams and CISOs and correspondingly their management, they came up with this forecast, so to speak. A third of security teams will be directly measured on their ability to create business value by the time we get to 2023. My personal view is, one, that's way too low. Two, it should have been happening for a long time. My view, it should be 100% of us are measured on that creation of business value on top of just managing risk. But I think, again, historically, we've been risk-centered, and that's the drive we've got for compliance and all the other reasons. But again, I think the economic shockwave many organizations have felt because of COVID-19 has caused a change in the business leadership dynamic to really want to, again, hold the security officer and the security teams more accountable to this. So if you're not already thinking that way, if you haven't felt that pressure yet, you will soon. Now, the other thing that I've said for a while in the industry, partly because I've experienced it, I've felt it, but our notion of defense in depth, right, which I actually like as a practical and strategic aspect of controls. But in reality, it's become expense in depth. We've just continued to add layer upon layer upon layer upon layer, and sometimes instead of doing what I call the weeding and feeding, going back and understanding, are we getting value out of our current investment? And I think, again, prior to COVID-19, and in some organizations, certainly not all, we were able to continue to grow our budget and ask for more because of the risk cycle. Again, COVID-19 changes the perspective on risk, particularly when there's top line revenue and net income issues, and we're having to spend money in organizations on other things to just allow employees to work or allow customers to come into our organizations. If you're in a grocery store or a hospital, you're spending more to protect the physical safety of employees and customers, which again is a drain on net income. And since organizations, certainly for-profit ones, are measured on revenue and net income and gross margin, again, it changes the dynamic a little bit. And we've got to think that way, in my view, in the security team, and look at the full notions of total cost. And I'll explain a little bit more about that as we go into it. But think of the fact that if you're constantly asking for more in a time where the business is constrained, again, you're going to have more friction. You're going to have more challenges within your organization. So sometimes being able to say, nope, I don't need any more, we'll figure it out. Even though that might be tough, it might be a more palatable dialogue, or better yet, how to show with a new investment how you can deliver not only a risk reduction, but real economic return. Again, Gartner, Forrester, a bunch of them have IT cost management type models and stuff. This one I pulled from Gartner. I think it's a pretty good one. It's similar to things that I've used over the decades, in terms of the structure and how you approach it. You certainly have the cost cutting. That's as stated here, it's a reactionary thing. It's you're missing revenue. You've got an unexpected expenditure in one spot, so you have to cut spending in another so that you can again maintain gross margins and net income levels, or manage your cash. Again, being a startup, cash is king. You're managing cash flows all the time, so that you don't get over your skis and spend more than you're collecting. But those are reactionary. They're short term. It's a tactical game that you're playing. And again, you can look at it and go, okay, what do I eliminate? How do I rationalize things? And then, where can you renegotiate with existing suppliers, whether it be service side or product side, stuff like that. Or in some cases, even payroll, right? Because some organizations have dropped bonuses, they've flattened or reduced or pushed out pay raises and stuff. So those are tactical cost-cutting things and stuff that you see typically in every organization. Then you have cost optimization. That's where you're looking at things in a bit more of a strategic level. I wouldn't say fully strategic, but kind of that annual financial plan review type thing, where you start looking at, hey, where can I increase efficiency? Where can I shift some spending? And again, you could look at shifts to software as a service as a cost optimization thing versus building a new data center for on-prem infrastructure. Again, those are structural optimizations that are done in IT, they're done in the business, and again, in the security team, we should be doing that. And then there's what I'd say the real strategic value. So where you're really understanding where the business is going, understanding the connections to different business processes, and you're aligning the value with what the business is trying to achieve. And therefore, your plan and the prioritization of it is very, very tightly coupled with the business. Now, having been a controller, financial controller, having run a large section of not only, all the security stuff I had when I was back at Intel, but I also ran a large chunk of Intel's IT organization for a number of years, the enterprise capabilities, all the finance systems, HR systems, stuff like that. And even when I was at Silence, IT had reported to me for a few years. That's where you really, you can get some of those alignments. And on the IT side, I think it's a little bit easier to tie an investment in a sales tool or a collaboration tool to business value. It gets harder when you get into infrastructure, and again, you're further removed sometimes from the value the further you get into the infosec side of things. So you really have to think about that flow from those infrastructure components into those other value areas. And again, that's where there's the opportunity to really demonstrate the value creation and then the innovation. And so again, the thing that I look at this and I go, this is typical IT, and it's not really different for security. Just the added expectation to reduce and manage risk along that path. And I always tried to, in many cases, if I could, and I still do this, if there was a big IT project, how can I connect into a transformational IT program and connect a control change or a control evolution into that? Because then I can ride the coattails of that other value creation. And in essence, hide underneath, in some cases, larger expenditures and more bodies going at an item, a upgrade to the SAP environment, the move to virtualization, some bigger structural shifts that IT is doing that, again, if you can nest sometimes some control changes underneath them, you can kind of clean some things up that are not super clean today. And again, you can kind of leap ahead and connect into somebody else's, in essence, efforts and draft them. So that's another tactic that I've used, particularly when there's a big value-driven effort on the IT side. How can I connect myself to that and then draft off of what they're doing to achieve a level of change and innovation and risk reduction and cost optimization? Now, getting to the notion of total cost, again, it's simple, but can be complex. But the simplicity of it is just to think about all the expenditures. It's all of the expenses. It's not just the initial cash outlay or the expense associated with purchasing something. So, again, one of the things that we typically wrap ourselves around the axle on is we look at the purchase price and any associated maintenance. And in reality, that's one element of the cost, but it's not the total cost. It's, how many bodies does it take to manage something? How much effort does it take? And in some cases, having a smaller purchase price can yield a greater total cost to the business. So you got to think about it in terms of total cost. And for me, when I've also done that, that means I have more budget to spend because I can think about my security controls and the ripple effect it has across other parts of IT or other parts of the business and associated indirect costs to them. And when I then add all of those things up, I can get a level of what's going to be fixed costs, what's going to be variable, what's going to be overhead. And again, the direct and indirect, what's the direct cost to my budget? What's the direct cost to the rest of IT? What are the indirect costs to other parts of IT and the business, right? So if something consumes a great deal of compute power, well, that means, we've got to have more compute cycles, where if I can reduce the compute consumption, again, I've given myself longer useful life of a desktop, a laptop, a server, my network infrastructure. So again, think about the things that way, because that allows you to see other spending and then be able to realize other value when you make changes to your control infrastructure. Now, again, further breaking this down into both cost and value, cost is all the center stuff, the tools, the headcount, again, other services, the hidden infrastructure cost. value is on the opposite sides of this. So on what I say, the direct implications of control improvements or controls that are insufficient or flawed, there's fraud, right? There's incidents. So you've got, if you're in a bank or some financial institution, it could be money stolen, right? It could be goods or services stolen. It could be, if you're in a retailer or e-commerce, you're getting chargebacks from banks or credit card companies. And again, those are fees that are borne by the business, somewhere. And if you can affect those things, because you can manage and mitigate the cyber side of those things, not necessarily, again, the physical incidents, but even there on the physical side, one of the things that I worried about a lot at Intel is shipment of processors. Processors are immensely expensive and they're small. So if you can get a box of them, they could be worth tens of thousands of dollars, or not, if not more. Or worse, hijack a shipment on a truck, or break into the logistics spot in an airport where those things are being transited from one location to another. And I was worried about that. Most people would think about it as the physical theft, right? The hijacking of those goods in a truck or in a warehouse. At the same time, you look at it and you go, if somebody was bold enough to go do that, how might they understand the shipment information? Well, if they could gain logical access to the procurement team systems, the shipping and logistics systems, that data would tell them the transit routes, the time, the types of processors in those trucks. And so again, a logical attack could actually contribute to the physical theft. And so again, there's associated things there that we need to think about. And then obviously the typical issues that we generally see in the InfoSec space, downtime or other operational costs occurred to an incident, and data theft and associated breach costs. And again, there's industry data on that stuff. Certainly if a factory's down or something like that, under ransomware, that's pretty easy to see what the revenue implications of that are. But again, adding that stuff up, adds to your ability to demonstrate value and lower, quote unquote, total cost if you can affect the loss rates on that side. And then there's the customer experience side. And, obviously in the context of some environments, customers that are directly impacted by a security incident sometimes takes their business someplace else. Might be temporary, but there is degradation of that customer stickiness. And the marketing team, the sales team, people who worry about brand loyalty, will be able to help you figure out what that means to them. And then, there's certainly the friction issues. If customers are have a poor customer journey because of the controls that we put in place, and the lack of ease of use, that could affect the brand value and how much business they do. And then obviously false positives, where we stop something that shouldn't have been stopped. And also that's a customer experience, customer journey issue. So again, think about it, values on the sides of it, and the real cost stuff is in the center. Now, again, former finance guy, I always thought about, because I had to, and I pushed this into the organizations where I was in finance, but even all the business units and security teams and stuff I've run, I have to have adaptable budget scenarios, right? So that I can pivot and be able to leap ahead constantly, depending upon the circumstances, versus staying a step behind. So I always anticipated the budget cut or the issue that might have ripple effects. So have a ZBB, if it's finance thing, zero-based budgeting. Start from, I have no budget. What do you spend on first and why? What do you spend second? And having that, in essence, line item clarity on things really is useful. I had so many dialogues with peers over the past couple of months that had aggregate budget stuff and big spending, but when they got a budget cut, or they were told to freeze where they had gotten used to years of a slight upward increase year on year in headcount and spending and stuff in their security teams. They didn't know what to do with all of a sudden, those 15 heads that you had requested be approved, 4 months ago, they're gone. And by the way, you need to drop another 3 heads, and all of your spending is flat, and we need you to trim 10%. They had to go through a massive budget exercise versus just have a tune-up to what they already knew, right? So having that in your back pocket so that you know what you do next if you got a windfall of money, or what you would cut immediately if you had to. Again, it adds to the velocity of how quickly you can act. And remember, you can't cut fixed cost. If it's depreciation, even though it's not cash, it's fixed, it's on the books. You can't affect that stuff. And again, which gets into operating expenditures and capital expenditures. Capital expenditures can depreciate over time. Operating expenditures are your in-period expenses, maintenance, payroll, tactical software purchases, and other services. And then also recognizing how you can play with those things. How can you capitalize software as a service? A lot of people say you can't. There are actually ways you can do that. So if you have more capital dollars to spend versus operating dollars, being familiar with accounting and working with your finance team so you can play between OpEx and Capex, depending upon the budget cycles and where the business has, in essence, available funds, will allow you to be more flexible and agile. Which brings me to burst capacity. A lot of organizations, they were running at their limit in their security teams. And, COVID-19 or a real incident causes them to almost be on their knees. And so again, growing up at in a factory environment at Intel, factories always ran near 100%, but we always had this concept of burst capacity. How do you surge to meet demand tactically, right? Knowing that you're going to be running over capacity. Having a concept of that for your headcount, your tools, and all that stuff. Again, understanding how you're going to do that and how you're going to manage it is a good thing for the flexibility. Knowing single points of failure, I think that's a typical risk issue, BCPDR. But again, those things can be constraints and cause real issues. And then there's this concepts of spans and levels. Again, if you have a larger team, you've got management team, you have administrative assistants. But one of the things that I've typically done, particularly when I've had to make strategic changes, is I look at my spans and levels and go, well, I hate to do this, but how do I have a manager manage more people? In which case I can reduce my management levels, have more worker bees. Even if you hold your headcount flat, you can, in essence, get more workload out of them when you flatten things. So really understanding spans and levels and how to do that tactically or strategically, again, will give you some additional flexibility. And then there's an area that I call ebb and flow. How do you take money from others and give money to others? There's nothing that's ever smooth about expenditures other than depreciation, because that's already baked, and maybe salary and stuff. But people have projects, and sometimes projects get delayed. Sometimes projects have cost overruns. So you have always these peaks and valleys. It smooths out when you get to the totality of an IT budget. Or again, when I was at Intel and I was spending $50, $60, $70 million a year on InfoSec, and then had $10 or $15 million in capital on top of that. That was easy to smooth out at that level because I could play within my budget. But Intel spent $1.5 billion on IT. But by understanding other people's peaks and valleys of expenditures, if somebody had a delay in a project or something got canceled, if I could, in essence, go steal their money or borrow it, because they were running light when I needed to run hot, or I had an opportunity to go do something, because it's, in some cases, some of that spending can be a use it or lose it. And so really understanding other people's spending so that, again, you can leverage money from them when they are running under spending. And then at times where you're running under spending, how do you actually give a little bit of money back to somebody else? That's also a really great way to play a little bit of hide and go seek with expenditures, but move the needle. And then, again, recognize that, and I know it's painful, but if you were held flat despite, COVID-19 or other, things going on, and other people are cutting, that's a relative increase in spending. And then we always have to consider the nuclear option. We've got to really completely structurally rethink our entire expenditures. And again, that's an opportunity for transformation, not just tactical. I'm going to stop this or stop that. How do I actually use that as a transformation mechanism? So again, breaking this down a little bit further into each of these buckets, how do I look at the opportunities for these things? Where to start? How does it cascade? Better automation, first and foremost. Automation is meant to deliver efficiency, effectiveness, right? That's economic return. So we have to start, in Malcolm's opinion, with better automation first. And then when you do that, particularly in the security space, then you can look at it and go, well, okay, if I've got better automation, does that allow me to reduce potential fraud or monetary loss, right? Beyond just tightening the limits of things, can the better automation, getting to earlier detection and prevention, allow me to spot those issues earlier? And then because of that, lower the incident and then lower the incident cost. On the customer experience side, again, obviously that if I can lower incidents, I've reduced customer impact, I've reduced false positives. And then hopefully with that better automation, I've also reduced the friction on the customer journey or the friction on the business processes and the internal users. Again, that's value creation. Evaluate alternative control points and control approaches, right? That is also a way, and then typically that will generally follow suit with better automation. But sometimes you approach it from better automation in the same space. Other times you look at it and you go, what's a different control approach, an alternative, and then go seek that out. And then those alternative control approaches to deliver value, again, should reduce incidents, be earlier in the detection and prevention cycle. And then ideally, again, reduce incidents, reduce false positives, and improve the customer journey. Now, so when you do all that, you're now seeing, in essence, the sprawl of cost optimization and value creation. Now, the other aspect of this, again, tactical one, I was in procurement for a long time, go beat up on your existing suppliers, renegotiate your contracts. That's certainly a cost reduction opportunity, cost optimization opportunity. But if I'm a supplier, again, or a procurement officer like I was, what's the best way to do that? Well, the best way to do that is to go evaluate an alternative vendor. Because if your incumbent vendor gets nervous, they're going to be more likely a little bit more malleable. So you have to play across all of these items. And certainly if that alternative vendor is better automation, an alternative control approach, you can really move the needle strategically in all of these areas, right? Now, some other example, I gave a talk on total cost and expense in depth at RSA, not this past year, but in 2019. And this is an example I used in it that I wanted to share again. And it's because the reality that I've seen, right? Circa 2006 at Intel, I created a policy, no hard drives leaves Intel. Why? We had found a flawed control, a 40% failure rate in the degaussers used to wipe hard drives and laptops, desktop servers. And we donated thousands and thousands of systems annually because we refreshed a lot, right? PC supplier, you're churning that stuff pretty frequently. And at the same time, Intel had an economic shockwave. It had whiffed on revenue and was seeing competition. And we announced roughly at the same time, we were laying off 10+% of the workforce. So there's flawed control. I had no money for remediation because my budget was flattened. So luckily I didn't get cut. I just got flattened. And then I had to play with my spans and levels of my management team and rejigger some things. But the estimated cost to really up level the degaussing equipment and all the stuff to have this control work properly, it's about 5 million in new equipment and a couple $1 million of labor annually across the environment. Now, what ended up happening was I didn't have the money. I couldn't let those drives just go out and be donated. So I stopped all corporate donations and a bunch of other things. And we basically pulled hard drives out of every laptop and server that we were no longer going to use, and stored them in metal drums in data centers, because the data centers had physical security and cameras, stuff like that. And literally for a long time, to the point that I had tens of thousands of drives stored around the world in a year. Now, I started getting beaten up because I was taking up space in data centers. The corporate donations team wasn't really happy with me, all that type of stuff. But I still had no ability to do anything else. And I finally got a little bit frustrated after people got frustrated with me, and I pulled the team together and said, look, guys, it's like, we have to solve this problem. And this is where the notion of innovation comes through starvation came from. And I'm like, look, I don't care. I looked at what I did at home. I just had a drill press and I just punched holes in those damn things and stuck them in the recycle bin from my house. And I'm like, well, crap, let's just do that at work. It's buy, a couple hundred of these drill presses for several $100s a piece, hire some, college students or late high school students after school, have them punch holes in these things and stick them in the recycle bin. And my CIO liked it, the controllers liked it. It's cheap, right? About $50,000 of equipment, $20 of labor per hour, a few $1,000s here, a few $1,000s there, no big deal. Then the safety police came after me, manufacturing environment, right? Heavy physical safety environment. And they didn't want some IT folks and some security folks in office locations using machining equipment, and certainly with contract labor. But then they had said, hey, Malcolm and InfoSec team, are you aware that Intel has a metal reclamation vendor? I'm like, what do we have a metal reclamation vendor for? Processors and the manufacturing stuff, you don't always get 100% yield, but the boards and the processors that were scrap, we had a metal reclamation vendor that would come pick up that scrap product and melt it down, because there was gold, platinum, precious metals in it. We had armored cars going back and forth to factories, delivering precious metals for the manufacturing process, and then taking away scrap product again to recycle it. I'm like, no, I had no idea. None of us did. And what we ended up doing is we had a dialogue with that metal reclamation vendor, and they actually paid us to take the drives so that they could shred them, melt them down. It was green, complete strong control, full data destruction, and I needed no money. And so that really kind of changed for me a long time ago, that innovation comes through starvation. So I'd challenge you that when you're held flat or you get a budget reduction, there are ways to innovate your way out of it and think about things differently. Now, again, when you start breaking this down more, again, you can see average, there's some industry data here, average loss per bank account for synthetic identity frauds, $10,000, chargebacks and merchant loss per transactions, all the security incidents that involve harvested credentials, all the ransomware stuff we've seen, the average cost of breaches. Again, you can do some measurement of a new control being X% faster at detection and prevention and add up that savings. Tools and headcount, the litany of different things, whether it be MFA, network security components, endpoint, services. Don't forget all the hidden infrastructure and labor costs, including legal and other costs. And again, when you play with it, what does that look like? And then the customer experience. Again, can you, whether it be an internal customer, an external customer, can you reduce help desk calls? Can you have an effect where you're reducing incidents and improving the customer journey? And again, you can see some data here that when the customer journey is better, There's real business value on the revenue side and customer retention and stuff like that. There might be the ability, because you're better able to manage risk, maybe the business can take more, maybe add a new business line, do something innovative on the business side that the security team enabled because they're better able to stay on top of different risk issues. Again, add that up. Now, again, meeting with the economic buyer. I'm an economic buyer. Again, just finance procurement guy in me. But when you meet with the person who really becomes either the primary decision maker to sign off on the purchase order or has to approve the purchase order you've put in, whether it be it's the group controller, the CIO, general counsel, whatever, right? And those vary depending upon the expenditure size. 5 simple slides. What's your current state? Negative implications of that, the alternatives, positive business outcomes with the alternatives, and recommendation and business case. 5 slides max. Bury the rest in the details in case they ask you a bunch of other detailed questions. But this is how you talk to an economic buyer. Now, the next few slides are a little bit more of the slide 5, because I wanted to show you that, because that really becomes the capstone slide. And sometimes I've always started with slide 5, and I'll show you what some of those look like, and then walk into the other one. So you could actually reorient this, and slide 5 becomes slide number 1, and then the rest of these become the backup. And again, I'll give you a few examples. Disaster recovery business case. If you're in manufacturing and retail, something like that, where you can really see the implications on the manufacturing of product or servicing and creating revenue, it's pretty simple. You can do the calculation. Loss of manufacturing capacity equals $10 million an hour, or 86.7 million annually, based upon the downtime you've seen or might experience because of a ransomware or something like that. It's no different than physical loss, right? If an earthquake happened or whatever. You've got maybe compliance and contract agreements that stipulate a comprehensive disaster recovery plan, and that's tested annually. And maybe in this context, those contractual obligations didn't include cyber mitigation that could disrupt manufacturing output. So to meet those contractual obligations and stuff, you've got to deploy something. Again, financial summary. Here's what it might cost, total return. Again, if you can deflect one incident, and that one incident is reasonably likely in a decent period, again, it's pretty easy to calculate net present value. But in the manufacturing environment, you also have to be sensitive to product margin, because any money spent in manufacturing hits product cost, and factory managers are pretty sensitive to that. So you have to think about that as well. Again, simple summary of milestones, some major assumptions, stakeholders, and key performance indicators. Are you going to be affecting manufacturing yield, positive or negative? What is it going to do to the contract compliance, the test results? And again, the impact reduction that you might have with the new controls. Simple summary. Almost anybody could understand it, ask a few questions, and use the rest as backup as needed. This one, another one page, I like this actual template a little bit better than the other one, but I figured I'd share a few. This one, I like to create project names. This one was Argus for all seeing and Elpis for hope, Greek gods. This example suffered, thousands of security incidents. Nothing too disastrous, but enough that it consumes time and effort and stuff. But 5 of them resulted in data breaches affecting, data loss that touched tens of thousands of customers. And then you look at it and go, okay, over the past couple of years, how much have we spent in this case on web application security, headcount, infrastructure, services, tools? And what was the breach exposure and the breach cost and the liability of that? Again, what's the analysis? When we're not comprehensive enough, our total cost is increased, and our automation wasn't sufficient to prevent, slow, detect, and respond. In this case, the web application security had deficiencies in controls. So replace the traditional WAF, move to something with higher efficacy, lower that type of stuff. And what the project snapshot looks like, Again, when you're making an investment, there's sometimes one-time cost, transitions and stuff like that. And then there's got your run rate. Description. How am I going to reduce false positives? How am I going to reduce incidents? How am I going to improve operating efficiency, right, of not only the security team, but in this case, the web applications team? And what's that going to look like? And the objectives. I'm going to remove controls. I'm going to implement new technology. I've got to train people. I got to rescope and reevaluate, SOC operations. And then, if you deflect the liability, deflect the cost of the incident, the payback's huge. If you're looking at it in terms of just pure cash on that cost side, hey, you could save or reinvest a couple $1 million, and then a little bit of the project milestones. Again, this is a really great, simple way to have a good dialogue with that economic buyer. This one, re-architecting network security. Again, I've heard over and over again from peers that they've had to cut cost. IT is getting a budget cut, 10, 15, 20, 25% due to COVID-19 realities without reducing IT services. And you start looking and go, how much have we spent on different things? In this case, customer had spent, upwards of $15 million on network traffic analysis and network security between headcount, infrastructure, services, tools. But they had a high false positive rate, right? They had overlapping capabilities. And then their own internal threat hunting team was limited because the tools that they had were basically just able to be used for forensics and rule-based alerting. And so again, when they looked at it, they can EOL existing tools and infrastructure, move to more advanced NTA solution, and then kickstart that with a whole managed network detection and response service. And then use that to initiate the transition, and then long-term think to bring it back in-house. Again, total cost, you've got one-time cost, again, it changed tools and people and stuff like that. And then your run rate stuff. And then again, the note, we're gonna EOL the phasing to coincide with the end of life of the other contract. So the cash return would be staggered a little bit. And again, you can see the description here, implement that platform with the managed network detection and response services. That could be done pretty quickly. And then over the course of time, work through that EOL transition to the other tools and SOC and process flows. Again, objectives, enable the new capability, EOL the other tools, train the employees and adjust the workflow, reduce the false positives. And again, when you look at it this way, you're demonstrating, hey, I'm saving millions of dollars while I'm also reducing risk, and I'm improving my own efficiency. And again, some conceptual ideas of how you would demonstrate some milestones. Another case, patch less, protect more. Patching introduces risk. It adds operational cost. There's things that we can do here that if we looked at some improvements in automation and looked at exploitability in our environment, not just the risk rating of the patch, we might be able to change our patching windows. We might be able to change how we do pen testing and controls validation rather than throwing bodies at it. And again, this is a good example of how you can use that breach and attack simulation type software to not only give you efficiencies around that, but also use it for another purpose. Pinpoint exploitability and then use that to, again, patch less, protect more. Focus where you've got the exploitability to do your patching versus just the broad-based stuff that we're constantly doing. And I'm not saying you do eliminate the broad-based stuff, but if you play with the patching windows to only the stuff that's exploitable and slide the rest out a little bit more into bundles of stuff, believe it or not, it reduces a lot of operating cost. I used changing of patching windows, 16, 17 years ago when I was at Intel to pay for a new tool. Because it allowed me to manage the risk better. Again, in this case, you can see, again, total cost, you can see the shift, and again, the summary. But I wanted to try and give you a few different ways that you can think about how to create these business case summaries, how to evaluate alternative control approaches, how to evaluate new vendors, and how to, again, demonstrate in a summary form some of the value and cost optimization that we talked about conceptually earlier. And with that, why don't I pause, and we've got a few minutes left, and Rudolph, if we've got any questions, why don't you shoot them at me and we can start knocking those down.
Excellent. Malcolm, thanks for the insights as always. So we do have a few questions. First one is, what are you seeing and hearing as kind of key security budget trends? Security is supposed to be one of those areas that always grows. Is that true in a year like this?
By and large, I can tell you from literally countless of dialogues with peers, including peer dialogue, Chatham House rules that I had this morning with a couple dozen folks in the financial services industry. Even they're seeing at least flattening of budgets, but almost everywhere else shrinking. I've had calls, certainly in the retail space, with peers and friends that their retail organizations, they might go bankrupt. Their security teams are on life support. One CISO I chatted with a few weeks ago, he's been furloughed for a couple months. And so in those situations that are feeling the brunt of the economic shockwave, definitely substantial budget cuts. Even in healthcare, despite the need for healthcare, the healthcare folks that I know are seeing budget pressure. Why? Because they've got additional expenditures coming because of the surge of COVID-19 and patient care and all the PPE they need to buy. And so that's causing constraints on spending in other parts of the business, right? So I'd say by and large, a downward trend, and some areas where it's just flat.
Got it. So somewhat kind of related question, I guess, is, as companies start to think about, and organizations start to think about, what the year ahead looks like. I guess the question is wondering if you could look into your crystal ball and, like, how do you recommend hedging between, are people going to be back in the office versus remote from a security strategy perspective? So it's less about budget, I guess, and more about the strategy as a whole.
I think we will, and we covered this a little bit when we did the COVID-19 webinar back a few months ago. I think this is an acceleration of trends that would have occurred. And I think a lot of this shift will be semi-permanent. I was hearing on the news, I live in Northern California, yesterday, and they were interviewing people in the Sierras that were getting out of the Bay Area. Why? Because their company got over the notion that they had to be physically at work. And so they're like, look, at this point, we'll, even if things settle back to normal, you can work remotely and probably come into the office a couple times a month, right? And so I think in those situations, it's going to be a semi-permanent shift. I think in the situations where, again, I'm at a grocery store, I'm at Costco, I'm in manufacturing and stuff like that, there's always going to be a need for physical presence, or at least some level of physical presence. But again, a dialogue I have with a friend in the semiconductor industry that I've known for a long time, large scale manufacturing similar to Intel, dialogue I had with them last week. The factories always had the notion that the factory workers needed to be at work. Well, because of this, they've realized that they don't. And there still needs some physical presence, right? But it's changing the notion of automation in the factory, and that might create a long-term shift where they'll be able to push, another 30-40% of workers in the factory and not need them over time, right? Because it caused the recognition that those people didn't need to be on site, and so let's automate some of that, or let's do remote management for certain things. So I think it's going to be a semi-permanent shift by and large.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. We actually did another webinar on how kind of incident response processes and things like that need to evolve as well. So I think you're probably right on that one. The last question, Malcolm, and this will appeal to the finance guy in you. I'm just going to read the question verbatim. We are very focused as an organization on minimizing CapEx right now.
Yep.
And I worry some of the choices we are making in the short term hurt our long-term operating expenses. Have you had any success stories on how to manage this particular challenge?
Yeah, to be honest, this is where, software as a service and infrastructure as a service and stuff like that, that's OpEx. So if you're being constrained on CapEx, run to the things that are variable cost. Perfect example, Awake's MNDR service, right? I mean, you get that's a service, that's operating expenditures, that's not capital, right? So I think you can literally look at that and play with it. And like I said, I've had to do that at times, or honestly try and convert OpEx into CapEx. Working at a big company with a multi-billion-dollar capital budget at Intel, it was most of the time easier to get capital than operating expenditures. And so I became, again, former finance guy. I knew how to convert OpEx into CapEx based upon how you bought stuff, the terms of the contract, and stuff like that. So sometimes you get a really smart procurement person in your finance team. You can work those because of the accounting rules, depending upon how you structure, quote unquote, the purchase.
Cool. We actually got one more question that came in as well. So as you add additional cyber layers, it's kind of always a challenge. How do you, how do you have the replacement conversation? And I'm paraphrasing here a little bit. And I think Malcolm, you kind of covered this in one of your case studies.
Yep.
Do you have any deeper insight you'd like to go into?
Yeah, it's a transition, just like anything, right? So you go back years ago, right? People had SAP, and then they moved to Salesforce, or moved to Workday and stuff like that. I have my, in essence, fixed existing infrastructure and legacy, and I move forward. It's a transitional item, and sometimes you need some investment to kick that off. But again, if you show a roadmap, like I tried to do with the case study, like for the advanced network transport analysis stuff, you got a few overlapping things. You've got some legacy stuff. Demonstrate, here's what I'm committed to do with the indicators. And yeah, I might need, a few $100,000 now to kickstart this investment, but here's the return I'm going to deliver and over what window, right? And if you can do that, you're, by and large, it then becomes a dialogue of when. Not what you're going to do, it's a when and how, right? Because if I was the economic buyer, I'd go, okay, great, I like that bet, I like that investment, but I'm sorry, Malcolm, I can only afford $250,000 currently versus the $400,000 you need for the investment to kick this off. Can you go get innovative and figure out how to do it within a $250,000 cost envelope for the initial investment, but everything else looks fine? Well, then you go back to your vendor, you go back to your team and say, okay, here's my constraints. What can you do? And because for me, I always look at the art of the possible, and it's always a negotiation. And I know both as a purchaser, when I've engaged my vendors that way, they've been very willing to work with me. And as a being in the vendor side, I know that when I've had dialogues with peers where I've done advisory work, or when I was at Silence and stuff like that, and they're like, "Hey, I'm stuck between a rock and a hard place. Everybody agrees with this, but I'm stuck, and here's my rock on headcount or spending or CapEx or OpEx. Can you help me work this?" I'd say just go engage your vendor on that, and if they're the right vendor, they'll help you figure it out. If they're the wrong vendor, they'll tell you, "Gee, I'm sorry, the price is the price, and I have no other options." And at that point, they're either the wrong vendor or you got the wrong salesperson.
Yeah, I think there was a comment that I think alludes to what you were saying is unfortunately there's no shortage of shelfware
Yeah,
in
exactly.
in security, right? And maybe in IT in general, but at least in security, I think, as an industry, we've not always done a great job of showing business value.
Yeah, wait, and we've got to focus on outcomes, right? The business requires outcomes on the business side. We've got to be accountable for outcomes on the security side. And the more we demonstrate we're going to be accountable to outcomes and we deliver them, we won't be limited in our investment. It's just going to be tactical ebb and flow of when you can do it, not what you're going to do, because you're demonstrating real business value.
All right. Excellent. Malcolm, I think that's all the questions we had. I want to thank everyone for attending. If you would like to share or view the recording, these are always available on Awake's YouTube channel. You could also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter for more of our insights. Malcolm, thanks again for your time and your experience that you were able to share with us today. We look forward to seeing everyone on the next Awake Security webinar. Visit us at awakesecurity.com. Thanks, and have a great rest of the day.